The time has finally come to start installing these components, these structures that I've been working on, onto the deck. Up until this point, I've felt that it's been more convenient for them to be loose, such that I can remove them when I'm working in another area of the ship, and then in doing so, by having them off of the ship, there's less chance that I will damage them. However, it has now gotten to the point where I think the opposite is true. When I'm working in an area of the ship now, I need to place these structures onto the ship to ensure that whatever is being added doesn't interact and obstruct these other components. This means I'm now at the point where I would need to regularly take these components off and replace them on the ship, and every time you handle a delicate component, you risk damaging it. It is because of this I now think it's safer for these components to be glued to the ship, such that I don't have to remove them. Although all of these components have been fully constructed, none of them have had any effects applied to them to help bring out the detail, like application of panel line or highlighting. So, before I install them, I'm going to do that process. To prepare the components for panel line, I'm going to first apply a gloss varnish across everything. The gloss varnish will make it much easier for the panel line to run cleanly along the details, and then it'll also make it a lot easier to remove that excess panel line. If you apply panel line onto a matte surface, it'll kind of diffuse into it and become very difficult to remove. Another thing to consider is that the panel line that I'll be using is enamel based, and that means I need to use an acrylic or lacquer varnish. The gloss varnish that I'm using is Mr. Color GX112. This is a super clear UV cut varnish. The UV cut is just a nice little thing to have to help protect the model from any sunlight. Although my models don't ever really see sunlight anyway, it's just one of those kind of scenarios where it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Another thing to note about varnishes, I find this both with gloss and matte varnishes, is that they need to be thinned quite substantially. If you don't thin them sufficiently, not only will the paint splutter and spatter all over the place, but on the periphery of the spray area, you'll get this sort of white frosting effect. I think that's just little balls of semi-dried varnish landing and sticking to the surface. If you do get that frosting effect, don't worry about it. It's easy to correct. You just load up Mr. Color leveling thinners and spray it over it if it's a gloss coat, and rapid thinners if you're spraying the matte coat. Ideally though, you don't want to get that frosting in the first place. Fortunately, it can be easily avoided by sufficiently thinning out your varnish. I find that these clear varnishes need to be thinned a lot more than normal color coat paint. This varnish is in the region of 5 to 10 parts thinner to varnish. It is extremely thin. It's basically like water. For the gloss varnish, you can thin it with any type of thinner you like. I've thinned this varnish with rapid thinner. You could just as easily thin it with leveling thinner. The only difference is that leveling thinner will make it take longer to dry. After spraying the shelter deck and the lower part of the forward superstructure, the upper superstructure, the aft funnel base, the forward funnel base, the aft superstructure, the pom-pom stand, and the various engine room vents, I set them aside to dry. Although this varnish, especially when thinned with rapid thinners, does dry to the touch very quickly, it is still very soft, and I don't want to start attacking it with panel line until it is properly cured. So I set them aside and left them for at least 24 hours before I started applying panel line. When it comes to applying the panel line, precision is not required. It just needs to be applied and allowed to flow around all the details. Because everything is covered in that gloss coat, I know that any excess will be very easy to remove. Having a bit of excess panel line that's sitting on these flat faces on the side of the superstructure is also not a bad idea. That can be used to simulate marks from water flowing down the side of the superstructure. The forward superstructure on the ship is very prominent, and there are lots of these quite large bare panels where I will be able to create that streaking effect. So it's for that reason that I'm applying quite a lot of panel line to this area of the ship. Even just applying the panel line and removing it will help add a bit of character to those panels, simply because in the process of adding it and removing it, you'll create subtle different shades of those grays in those areas, which will make it look a bit more realistic instead of this monotonous, very consistent color. That's what you're trying to avoid. Those solid, unbroken colors are what makes it look fake. For the other areas of the ship, there's less need for a lot of panel line to create streaks and other sort of texture effects. It's just really being used to bring out the details. This means that I can be more precise, and the easiest way to be more precise with panel line is to actually thin the panel line even more. If you have a very thin panel line, you'll make it flow a lot more easily into the details, and you'll leave behind very little residue on flat surfaces. This makes it a lot easier to clean up because there's just less of it to remove. So this panel line that I'm applying here with a brush, I've thinned it with roughly 1 to 2 parts enamel thinner to panel line. As you can see, it's flowing a lot better and leaving far less residue behind. This is going to make it so much easier to clean up. After finishing applying the panel line to the shelter deck, I then apply the panel line to the aft funnel base. This is also that very thinned out panel line. Once again, there's not a lot of bare flat surfaces for me to deal with over here, so this rather thin panel line will work quite nicely. The same treatment is then given to the aft superstructure, the forward funnel base, the pom-pom stand, and the various engine room vents. By the time I had finished applying panel line to all of the components, the first components that I had applied panel line to were ready for me to start removing it. That's just because it took a surprisingly long time to apply all this panel line. They're just a lot of components with a lot of detail to get through. Anyway, to remove the excess panel line, I need to use some kind of enamel thinner. Turpentine works well, but it has a smell that I really just don't like. So I prefer to use Mr. Weathering Color Solvent, which is odorless. Having said that, I do find that turpentine is actually a little bit better at lifting panel line. So if I do come across a bit of a stubborn patch that I want removed, I will switch over to turpentine just to get that bit off. In either case, the process for removing the panel line is exactly the same. I use a brush to carefully lift off the excess and make sure that I'm trying to preserve some of the panel line around the details. Something to remember at this stage is that with this panel line applied onto a gloss surface like this, it is going to appear more vivid than it will appear once a matte coat is applied on top of it. So I just keep that in mind and make sure that I don't remove too much of it, otherwise this process becomes a little bit pointless. Having said that though, even just applying the panel line and then trying to remove all of it will have a bit of effect. You'll never get it back to exactly what it was like before you applied panel line. But in my opinion, it still looks better, so you can't go wrong on this thing. Even if you try to remove all of the panel line, it will still look better than when you started. This is a very low risk process. The only thing that you need to be absolutely certain of is that if you're using an enamel based panel line, you are not applying it on top of an enamel based varnish. Because when it comes to this part of the process, if you are using an enamel solvent to remove the excess panel line, you would also remove the varnish, and that would cause you all kinds of problems. After removing the excess panel line from the forward superstructure components, I move on to the funnel bases and the aft superstructure, and here you can see how much less panel line there is for me to remove, simply because I used that very thinned out panel line in the first place. Here I'm kind of blending more than anything else, and this actually goes quite quickly, and it leaves a very nice effect. Already, even without a matte coat applied to seal it in, or the highlighting on top of that, it already looks so much better. It's broken up that monotonous monotone of grey that was just everywhere. These very subtle effects that are also very easy to apply do a surprisingly large amount of work to improve the overall look of the model. Once the excess panel line has been removed, once again the parts are set aside to dry for 24 hours. I want to make sure that that oil-based panel liner is completely dry. The matte varnish I'm using is Tamiya XF86. When it comes to choosing a matte varnish, you really can choose whatever you like. You can use enamel or lacquer or acrylic, it really doesn't matter. This is the Tamiya acrylic varnish. I like acrylics or lacquers simply because they dry quickly. I don't really like enamel paints. I only really use them for weathering where its slow drying property is actually useful, or if I can't find an acrylic in the color that I need. But yeah, that's besides the point. Anyways, as I was saying, after the panel line has dried, it is then just a matter of sealing everything in with the matte coat. When it comes to the matte coat, you actually don't need as much of it as the gloss coat. I mean, it's not really protecting anything, it's just matting down the gloss effect. and that matte effect comes down pretty quickly, even when the varnish is very thinned out. One thing that I do find with this Tamiya varnish is that it never really takes it back to the same level as matte paint itself. It has a almost semi-gloss effect to it. I wouldn't say it's semi-gloss, but it's like almost semi-gloss. But I think that's appropriate, because often you'll find with ships, if you were to actually go and stand right up next to a ship, you would see that it is actually painted with a gloss paint. It is just the scale effect when you're far away from a large object like a ship, that gloss coat appears more matte. That's why, even though these ships often had gloss paint, the models are painted with a matte paint. Gloss paint would look unrealistic in viewing a ship from far. So the fact that this tones down that gloss into a kind of light semi-gloss, I think is appropriate and creates a good effect. If you want to get it to be very matte, like back to what it was when it was just the raw color coat, or even more matte than that, then use Mr. Color 182 Flat Clear. That stuff is incredibly powerful. It's also quite thick in the bottle, so you'll need to thin it a lot, and then just be very careful with it, because it touches something and it goes matte so quickly, it's unbelievable. Anyways, I'm not using that here, using XF86, because I can pretty much spray as much of it as I like, and I don't have to worry about overdoing it. I know the effect is going to be pretty good. Once again, after spraying the matte coat and all of the components, they are set aside for another 24 hours before I start highlighting. There are many ways that you can highlight details on a model. The most common way is to use a dry brush technique. I don't bother with dry brushing. I think there are some unnecessary extra steps in that process. Basically, you're taking a wet paint and letting it dry out into a sticky substance. I'll say, well, why don't you just start with a dried out sticky substance? That's effectively what a weathering powder is. The weathering powder that I'm using here is Snow on Tamiya Weathering Master Palette B. And to apply it, I'm using the soft end of the applicator brush. The other end has a sort of sponge on it that is far too harsh and puts down far too much of this powder. With the soft end, simply brush it backwards and forwards in the palette to pick up a bit of powder, and then gently swipe it over the details on the model. This will put down a very small amount of powder and nicely highlight the raised edges. Because it does only put down a very small amount of powder, it does require quite a bit of back and forth, but that's good because it gives you control. You don't have to worry about overdoing it in a single swipe. If I do apply too much powder in an area and I want to remove some of it, I can simply spray lacquer thinner in the area to thin it out. One thing to be aware of is that spraying lacquer thinner will not completely remove the powder. There will be some residue left, but in my experience, in the few occasions where I have overdone it, it actually softens it to an effect that I want to keep. If I were to apply so much powder that I got it into a situation where even lacquer thinner couldn't thin it out, I'd then have to repaint the area, effectively starting again with the whole process. Fortunately, I haven't found myself in that position yet. After completing the highlighting process using the powder, I can immediately move on to installing the components on the ship. I don't bother to seal in the powder with another layer of matte coat. Doing so is just going to thin out that powder a little bit more and make that effect even more subtle. If I'm happy with how it looks, I will leave it. After the long process of applying all of these effects to the model, I now can finally install these components. Installing all of these components onto the ship is, at this point now, a very simple process. There have been many occasions over the past year, I suppose, where these components have been built and test fitted and retest fitted multiple times. It's at this point where I know absolutely everything will fit in place. So this is just simply a matter of applying the appropriate glue in the appropriate way to the component and putting it in place. The first components that I'll install are the funnel bases, starting with the forward funnel base. First I put it in position, it's very tight, it almost clips in place, and then I just glue it down using extra thin plastic cement. The same treatment is then given to the base for the aft funnel. After the funnel bases are installed, I apply thick plastic cement to the location where the base of the funnel will sit, and then I place the funnels on top of their bases. Next, I use thick plastic cement to install the top section of the forward superstructure. I then move aft to install the engine room vents. Since the engine room vents are photo etch components, I install them using thick superglue. Next, it is the turn for the aft superstructure to be installed. This is a plastic component, so it is glued down using thick plastic cement. Forward and aft of the aft superstructure are more engine room vents. These are also photo etch components, so they are once again installed using thick superglue. The last structure to be installed is the pom-pom stand. This is also a plastic component, so it is also installed using thick plastic cement. Once all these structures are glued in place, there are a few more touch-ups that need to be done here and there. The base of various pillars needs to be glued to the deck. I glue all of these pillars in place using extra thin super glue, simply because the super glue will set quickly and hold them in the correct position. All of these glues, the super glue, the plastic cement, whether it be thick or thin, will leave a slight glossy residue along these joint lines, and that is an effect that I don't want. So I spray all of the joints where the glossy glue is visible with another layer of matte varnish. And with that, the installation of all of these components on the ship are complete. This is now the first time in a very long time that all the components that I have constructed are actually attached to the ship itself. From this point onwards, after I've constructed a component, it will be installed upon the ship. It won't be left on the side to be installed at a later point. In my mind, it makes me feel like the ship is moving now into the last stages of the build process. It is now getting very near the end. In the next video, I'll prepare, paint, and install the 16-foot dinghies that go in these cradles on the side of the forward funnel base. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.